How's it going, everybody? This is the Nitty Gritty. My name is Chad. With me, as usual, is Leonard. This is a show about wrestling, and we did a book review for you, which is a first, and this will also be a first for us, which is I'm going to be reviewing a podcast that I listen to. It's a short podcast, not an ongoing one, obviously, but we're going to be talking about the podcast called Ashley versus WWE, the story of wrestler Ashley Massaro. And it was released September 7th, 2023. It runs about 3 hours and 41 minutes, and it is a Audible original. So through some news site, I discovered that this was going to be released, and I thought it might be interesting to listen to. And I have an Audible account, so it didn't cost me anything. So if you don't have an Audible account, I think that it might be the only way to listen to it. I actually didn't check if it's on YouTube or anything like that. It might be. But you can check it out there. And like I said, it's not a long podcast, but I did think it was worth checking out. For those who might not remember Ashley Massaro, she first came to be in the wrestling world in 2005. She was a contestant in the Raw Diva Search. Remember when that was a thing, Leonard? What was your opinion about the Raw Diva Searches?
You know, I enjoyed Tough Enough. The Diva Search, not so much. Although I will say they did get some okay. Didn't Christy Hemme come from the Diva Search?
He did indeed, yep.
Yeah, and a few others. I think it was them trying to do something titillating past the point where they were doing that on a regular basis. It's not necessarily a bad idea if all they were looking for was, say, a spokesmodel. The fact that they then had to teach whatever girl how to wrestle, that was always the problem. You know, they didn't want to take wrestlers and, as I make air quotes, pretty them up. They wanted to take fitness models and teach them how to wrestle, which outside of, say, like Trish Stratus, never really worked.
Funny you should mention. We will touch on that very thing here as we podcast. So Ashley Massaro did come from the modeling world that prior to becoming a member of the WWE roster, and she would win that Diva Search August 15th, 2005. She would win. And this is not a recap of her career. So for those listening, I'm sorry, I'm not going to recap her entire career or life. I'm going to go through some of the bullet points of this podcast. I forgot to mention it is narrated by Isabel Thompson, produced by Rachel Byrne. And so right off the bat, like, this is a podcast that is taking the point of view of, like, it's basically telling you about wrestling as if you've never heard of it before. Now, wrestling fans who have checked out documentaries and such, I'm sure are used to this to a certain degree. I am. I kind of like accept it and move on. If that bothers you, this might not be for you, but go ahead.
The people who are involved here, who are they?
Just as far as I know, just a journalist.
Right. So they would take that tactic because they don't know any better.
Right.
And they are probably pitching this to a non-wrestling audience, or want to, because the wrestling audience is probably going to see the name and tune in, but they want to, I would guess, want to appeal to a non-wrestling audience as well. So you kind of have to do some explanation.
Right. Absolutely. And, like I said, this is, marketed as Audible original. So they want anybody who has an Audible account to check in. So
the idea is that her story is interesting, not so much that she's a wrestler.
Right. Well, this is more about the situations that led to her suicide, and less about like a, point by point explanation of her life and career. Although they do go over some of those points. So, it starts out, talking, giving you a background on wrestling in general, some of the lingo, some of the history. Then they go into Ashley's life, and they talk about Vince McMahon a lot, and specifically the era that Ashley was a talent in, and how raunchy that era was. So this is painting the person who narrates this, and I would guess the person who produces it, are people that don't like wrestling. So that will be a turnoff for some of you, as it was for me. These people clearly do not like wrestling. They're trying to paint a certain picture of what happened with Ashley, and we'll get to the issues that come about there. But that is kind of the attitude I got right away. So they talk about some of the ways that blurring the lines of reality and storytelling in wrestling, and they touch on some of the misogyny regarding this raunchy era that was there, both on screen and maybe even behind the scenes. Now, as Leonard just mentioned, they wanted these fitness models and then wanted them to transition into being a wrestler. So for somebody like Ashley, she wanted to train. She was training in Long Island at times, but they, actively told her that she can't, and, began to stop her from training altogether, which this podcast, rightfully so, will show you that, like, this is a person who wanted to train, was trying to get better, but because she wasn't able to do that and get better, this could lead to injuries in the ring. And,
do they say why WWE stopped her from doing training?
not not outright, like, they kind of paint the picture like she would maybe have time to do that here and there, or maybe that, like, she could just, if she had time, train before the events, stuff like that.
I thought maybe it was because she was seeking independent training, and they were like, "No, you have to do our people," because WWE is very much about WWE style.
And that probably was the line that she was given, like, just, not maybe trainer we're affiliated with or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, she wasn't given adequate training, and
Yes.
that would lead to injuries. But the big part about this podcast is what happened to Ashley when they went on a tour, tribute for the troops, in Kuwait. There was an incident. I'm not going. This came out via an affidavit later on, after, I think after her death. Basically, she alleged that she was sexually assaulted, after, when she was supposed to be receiving medical training. They were on a military base, and a lot of the WWE people had left. I think there were a couple people still there, but that she was viciously sexually assaulted, and that is kind of the climax of this. So
Did they say by who, or was it someone that she in the military?
was somebody in the military,
Yeah,
and
because it did not sound like it was a WWE individual.
that would have probably been a much bigger news item. But yeah, this was somebody in the military, or somebody that was possibly posing as somebody who was a doctor, or, somebody that was kind of snuck in to where Ashley was after she was receiving medical attention. Apparently, she was given, like, not by her choice, like this, like, paralytic drug that prevented her from being able to move. So it's a horrible situation, that she was involved in, and so this was obviously like a big turning point in her life, and so much of the podcast tries to go about, like, the aftermath of that, who knew about it, and was it covered up. And so the podcast alleges that she spoke to people in WWE, but that they, had a meeting with her and basically wanted her to be silent because they wanted to protect their relationship with the military, because the tribute to the troops is a very big deal.
Sure.
That sounds like a very likely stance for a business to take, right? That's about as softballish as I can explain it without like outright accusing them. So that was a big part of this as well. And that compound that incident with the fact that she was performing through injuries. And Leonard, via documentaries and podcasts and all this kind of stuff, that when you're injured in pro wrestling, there's often this, kind of maybe unsaid urge to keep the people performing even through these injuries. Maybe the talent thinks they're going to lose their spot, or maybe there's pressure from people in the back to, keep going, and even when maybe they shouldn't. And obviously, a lot of things have changed. And now, when somebody is injured, there's more of an immediate reaction of, let's take this person off the road, let's take this person out of the show, out of the match, whatever. But it wasn't always like that. Am I right?
Yeah, and all sports were like that. You talk about concussion protocols with the NFL was a big one. It was always, rub some dirt in it and walk it off. And it was like that in all sports, and then also wrestling. And I think they have gotten better at that. And I think part of it was a double-edged sword, because it was the company wanting you to perform and the performer saying, well, I'm not going to let on how bad it is because I don't want them to take me off the road or to lose my spot. So I think it was one of those, we won't ask you too much and you don't tell us too much, and we'll keep the status quo.
Right. And I think in this case, one of the main injuries was there was a fracture. I believe it was either her arm or her hand. And they wanted her to just get right back into the ring after like a couple weeks or something like that. And that wasn't enough time for it to heal. And so that was one of the issues that she had. And like all of this, it was kind of like building for her, right? One of the main interviews that they do is with a Dr. Rios, who was a doctor at the
time. Was it S.A. Rios?
It is not. It is not S.A. Rios.
Okay.
That would have been funny. This is Dr. Rios that did work for WWE, and he stated that he knew about the assault, like not that he was there, but that he had heard about it via gossip in the back, that it was kind of going around. So a lot of the latter half of this podcast is Isabel Thompson, the narrator, trying to get interviews with people, trying to get interviews with people that knew Ashley or people that knew about the assault, trying to kind of find her way into the wrestling, into the WWE, like not locker room, so to speak, to try and find people that will go on record and say, yes, we knew about this assault, or yes, we knew that they asked her to be silent. And, at one point it gets somewhat Michael Moore-ish because they try to go to WrestleMania, and, she's like, oh, it would be great if we could get an interview with Vince, or, somebody like that. And obviously, that's not going to happen, because if they got
call ahead first. Call ahead first.
Well, yeah. And WWE, they say, doesn't officially comment on.
No, they don't anything. Before, because you're shifting gears, let me ask you: did they talk anything about the fact that she was one of their Playboy cover models and how that played into anything?
Yes, she was.
Okay.
Probably that was like, she was more than happy to be a part of that. That was a big deal.
Okay.
And
a quick sidetrack here, and because of it, I think it's probably a shame that they don't do that anymore. I think that was really actually a great partnership. And if you're going to do something like that Playboy is the most tasteful way to do it, and I think especially now Playboy would probably benefit from it more than what WWE would. But I'm glad to hear that that was something that she, given everything else you've said so far, that was an experience that she enjoyed doing, and saw the importance of it for her career. Because I like hearing that, because of everything else that you've said with the sexual assault and different things.
Yeah, and I think that if I recall, now I wasn't watching wrestling really around this time, but I think that they had a whole big to do about her cover and stuff on Raw. I want.
Yeah, they always did. I'm trying to think. It was because I know around this time it was Maria, it was Ashley, it was Christy Hemme did it. Of course, Tori Wilson and Sable and China before them, and I'm probably missing a couple of the other ladies that did do it. But they always made it was an annual thing there for a while, and they always made a big thing about the cover unveiling. Because you never knew who the girl was until they would do the cover, and it was a giant size cover over the ring, and they would drop a drape, and they really made a big thing out of it at the time.
Right. No, absolutely. They interview her friends and stuff throughout this. I think they interview a former security officer that was a part of WWE who knew her, and you know, like basically they're trying to build towards like a big interview get, and we'll get to that here in a second. So they talk about her exit from WWE, and this is where I started to have some issues with this podcast, because they talk about her exit from WWE and they describe her last on-screen appearance, which for people who don't remember, I could probably post a picture of it if, is she accidentally spills coffee onto Vince's shirt. And Vince then, tears her a new one and says she's fired because it was clearly an accident and all this kind of stuff. But Vince was playing the Mr. McMahon character.
Yeah.
And they made it seem like that was like blurring the line.
Shoot.
Like, and that's just not the case. So she did leave in 2008. And one of the reasons that she left was because of her daughter being sick. So a week prior to, she was released. And as far as I know, she asked to be let go of her contract because of her daughter being sick. So like there are certain things that if they don't address at all, they skim over it because they want, to paint the picture that like after the assault, that it was just this constant downward spiral. And to an extent, I'm sure that is the case, but her release was something that she had asked for. And of course, she was involved in the class action lawsuit that Konstantin Kairos had organized, and that didn't turn to anything for anybody that was involved.
That stalled out and didn't go anywhere, to my memory.
But I think that's where this affidavit about the sexual assault, I think that's how that eventually.
That would make sense. Yeah.
So the big interview at like they do talk to Mick Foley and Melina, and like I said, I mentioned that she's trying. She went to WrestleMania, the host, and tried to get interviews with other people there. But they kind of skim over her suicide. I'll get to that in a second. But the big interview get is Paul London, who dated Ashley Massaro.
Okay, I was like, if your biggest get is Paul London, you're not doing something right.
On the surface, it's like Paul London, who cares? But
yeah. And I have listened to some of Paul London. I don't know if he has a podcast or he's guested on a lot of podcasts, but I have listened to him. And he is all about spilling all the tea he can possibly spill. He just goes off on anybody he can go off on. And he didn't seem like he liked anybody. And it seemed like everybody was trying to hold him down.
Right. So, like, he is, asked a bunch of questions, and he verifies that she was silenced into speaking about the assault. He also said that she was at times pressured to go on the private jet. He also alleges that Vince came to her hotel room at one point. Again, I don't know what of this is true or not. And here, leads to the ultimate problem with this podcast, and that is they can't prove anything. The assault is an affidavit, written in an affidavit. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the silencing, the wanting to have her not talk because of the relationship with the military, who knew about it, all this kind of stuff. Like, they can't prove any of that. So it's just a lot of fluff, basically.
You know, as a journalist myself, yes, that affidavit, the court documents, that's, you know, your bread and butter. That's your gold. That's what you have. But everything else is accusations that you can't prove or disprove. And I would not have ever included in a story because it opens yourself up to libel and slander charges. Now, again, I don't know how they present it or not present it in that regard. But, you know, I always err on, if I don't have the proof of something, I don't use it. You can't use it.
Right. And like I said, and they kind of dance around, like there's no outright like accusations, but that the picture is clearly trying to be painted in that this is what happened to her. This is how WWE reacted to it. That really, was a traumatic turn of events for her. The injuries, performing through the injuries, it led to her release, and so on and so forth. And they skim over the fact, in my opinion, they skim over the fact that she did have some drug issues, and they skim over her suicide and the nature of it, which sadly was via hanging, and it's terrible. And I don't even think that's on Wikipedia. Like, TMZ was my source for looking that up, because it took me a little bit to figure out exactly what happened there.
Oh yeah, because they're scum and they don't care.
Right. And yeah, so she died May 15th, 2019, and apparently had filmed a PSA for being against suicide before her death. Ashley Massaro's story is quite sad, and my personal opinion now, I can certainly believe that WWE would want to protect the relationship with the military. I can certainly buy that. And I can certainly buy the fact that her having experienced this horrible event in Kuwait was probably, and not being able to do anything about it or bring anybody to justice. They even interview somebody in the military, talking about all the rape that would go on military bases across the world.
Yeah, and that became a big news story at one point. I think it was past the point. I think it was early teens, so it was past the point that the incident happened with her.
Right, and so it's I am really sad that she's not with us any longer. She, by all accounts, was a cool, and they have a segment where her best friend is like, standing at her grave and tearing up and stuff. And this is a person who really loves wrestling to this day, but obviously harbors some, bad feelings about WWE and how they treated her. And, that's the big story, is how she was treated after this happened. My opinion of this podcast, though, is I can't recommend it, because if you look up what happened, you can kind of get come to the conclusions yourself. There's a couple pieces of information that you might not have known, but there's a lot of padding for people that don't watch wrestling. And like I said, this is 3 hours and 41 minutes, so there's really, when I say padding, for a 3 hour and 41-minute podcast, there's just not a lot here. And it reminded me in a way of like the Serial podcast when they did a whole season on Adnan Syed, for true crime aficionados out there. And it just a person is trying to take a stance, trying to prove, like in that case, trying to prove that this guy was innocent. And I actually think he is out now, but that beside the point. At the time, like trying to prove something, and at the end of the podcast season, they can't prove it, and so that's kind of what you're left with. And that's kind of the parallel I'm trying to draw here with this podcast is they're trying to tell you something, and they can only prove certain things, and the things that they can't prove, you just kind of left with like, okay, this is a really sad story, but it didn't get any interviews with anybody from WWE, obviously. And so that's why this is kind of probably flying under the radar to a certain extent on Audible. So yeah, it was an interesting listen and a very sad story, but I can't recommend it. Leonard, do you remember a lot about Ashley Massaro? You mentioned the Playboy shoot, but
yes, I do remember her being one of the Diva Search winners. And, I always kind of group her with what I mentioned, Christy, Hemi, and Maria, and those types that were more, had decent personalities, but were mostly just pretty faces that were kind of, would have been better off as valets or backstage interviewers than trying to be forced into the ring. Of course, I do remember her being one of the Playboy models. I remember when she was let go. I remember hearing about her suicide and not a whole lot of details around that being released at the time. But of course, a lot of outpouring of support from the people who worked with her there and there. And yeah, it's certainly someone I remember. But, if I was going to list, say, my favorite all-time women, she probably doesn't make the top 50. Because she wasn't there that long and she wasn't given a whole lot to do. So just as a wrestling personality, but it is a very tragic story, and I'm kind of sorry because from what you're telling me, again, I haven't listened to the podcast. It sounds almost exploitive that they're picked her and they're trying to use wrestling terminology, her story to get themselves over. In a way here. And I mentioned earlier about being a journalist myself. And, being a documentarian is a little bit different because when you construct a documentary, it's almost like writing a term paper. You go in with a thesis and you're trying to prove the thesis. Now, if you don't prove it, you should go back to the beginning and rewrite it. But what you often find is a lot of the times, and what you find with this, is we're just going to pound that round peg into the square hole until it fits, and it doesn't sound like it works yet.
Right, and that kind of stuff gets on my nerves, especially in documentaries. The documentaries I like, take somebody like Ken Burns, for example. He just tells you the story straightforward. That's personally why I like it. Don't cut corners. Don't paint me a certain picture that isn't true. Like another good example, Searching for Sugar Man, that documentary about the musician who was apparently, they tell you, was a recluse, and these guys doing the documentary rediscovered him, which was a total line of horse shit because he was like still touring and releasing albums, just not anywhere in the U.S. So, like,
he was big in Africa, if I remember correct, wasn't it, or South Africa or something like that?
It was either Australia or Africa, something like that. It's been
many
documentary. But, that kind of stuff, tell me the whole story. Tell me both sides. Try to be neutral. If you have an opinion, like Werner Herzog's documentaries, for example, he'll state his opinion, but he'll show you both sides of it. And in this case, they're trying to paint, they have a thesis and they don't want to vary from that. And the parts that kind of disprove or add bumps in the road to the story they're trying to tell, they kind of skim over or leave out. So in that way, I don't know if it's worth your time, but by all means, if you have listened to it, let me know what you think. If you disagree or agree, if you want to share any memories of Ashley Massaro watching, please do, and check out other episodes. Segment Surgery, What's That Card, Stupid Questions, Random Match Reviews, and we are also available wherever you listen to podcasts. For Leonard, My name is Chad, and we will see you next time.